Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. Thank you. We continue, I guess, what could either be characterized as Mr. Toad's wild ride from Wind in the Willows, but actually we are on a really important sequence of discussions. As I mentioned, and will say again, yesterday we began the journey with Liza Mundy talking with us about her research and award-winning book about the Code Girls, a group of about 11,000 women who in 1942 finally had their educational promise and opportunities recognized by the federal government in ways that were significant in ending World War II. And at the end of that story, those beautiful, bright, sophisticated women worked with machines to increase their opportunities to learn, manage information, and move forward. Yesterday afternoon, we took a giant step from 1942 into the present and beyond with a discussion of artificial intelligence and big data and what impact that is having and will have on law, medicine, and business. Our panel challenged us yesterday, leaders of all the different professions, to exercise, identify moral, ethical, and visionary leadership in this time of, I guess we could call it uncivility, incivility, but to be visionary in a positive and proactive way. And we put together a group of folks whom you will absolutely enjoy hearing from and interacting with. Some examples of the vision that we have seen in the past, of course, would be Abraham Lincoln, who foresaw and fought for a united America, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who had a dream of equality, George Washington, who lost most battles, but his dream was to win the independence of the United States. President Reagan foretold the fall of the Berlin Wall. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths." And Aristotle, way back when, identified that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, but I guess more accurately, it was the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. So here we are, and let me introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to exit stage left, as they say, and let them get to work. Professor A. Mechele Dickerson, member of the law faculty at the University of Texas at Austin School of Law. She holds the Arthur Moeller Chair in Bankruptcy Law and Practice, honored as a university distinguished teaching professor, a nationally recognized scholar and global media expert, author of the forthcoming book from Harvard University Press, The Neglected Middle Class, Inequality, Race, and the Looming Economic Crisis. She's testified before Congress on these subjects. A graduate of Harvard Radcliffe Colleges and Harvard Law School, she clerked for the Honorable, now retired Nathaniel Jones, entered private practice in Virginia, joined the law faculty at William & Mary, where she served as a professor of law before heading to the University of Texas. And there, she also has served as an associate dean for academic affairs, an elected member of the American Law Institute, which is quite an honor. And very much of an honor, she has served on the Board of Governors of the Virginia Bar Association. Yes, absolutely. Lieutenant Colonel Aram Donigian. He's obviously, if you look at what he's wearing on his chest, you will know that he has over 20 years of service as an infantry and public affairs officer, a 1998 graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, 2008 graduate of Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan, conducting combat operations, advising and mentoring management faculty at the National Military Academy of Afghanistan, and directing the engagement cell for Combined Joint Interagency Task Force Shafafiyat, the Counter-Corruption Staff Section for the International Security Assistance Forces headquarters. He has served as a Director of Leadership Programs at the United States Air Force Academy. He co-founded the West Point Negotiation Project and served as the co-director, helping to enhance the ability of military leaders to engage more effectively in the complex and challenging negotiations they face in both peace and in combat situations. He's co-authored several articles on military negotiation, one of which, Extreme Negotiations, What U.S. Soldiers in Afghanistan Have Learned About the Art of Managing High-Risk, High-Stakes Situations, published in the Harvard Business Review in 2010. Now, as I finish that side, I finish with our moderator, Jeanne Franklin, past president of the Virginia Bar Association, longstanding member of the Special Issues Committee, a Vassar graduate, UVA law graduate. She is practices mediation, Virginia certified mediator and mediator mentor, trains lawyers and others in mediation and facilitation techniques. I commend you to her website, Franklin Solutions, in which there are 4 pages of accolades and honors and experience that is dynamic. Stacy Lee, coming to this side of the room. Stacy is president of the Old Dominion Bar Association, our statewide black bar association in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Previously has served as president of the Hill-Tucker Bar Association. She participates, as you would expect, in a number of civic and community organizations. In 2015, she received the Communication and Leadership Award for the Richmond chapter of Toastmasters International. She has recently been recognized as an honoree in the 2017 class of up-and-coming lawyers by Virginia Lawyers Weekly. This year, 2019, she has been noted as one of the influential women in the law by the Virginia Lawyers Weekly, and she too is a member of the Virginia Bar Association Special Issues Committee. Now, last but not least, President James E. Ryan. He is the 9th president of the University of Virginia, and as you know, a leading expert on law and education. And one of the reasons you know that is that in 2014, he was kind enough to engage with us on a panel of this association put on by the Special Issues Committee on what is the enduring legacy of Brown versus Board of Education. At that time, he had recently authored 5 Miles Away, A World Apart, a book based on an analysis of 2 schools in Richmond, Virginia, published in 2010 by Oxford University Press. And his most recent book, Wait, What, and Life's Other Essential Questions, based on a 2016 commencement speech that was published in 2017. And I've read it. I read it again. I've got one down there with tabs in it, and so we commend it to you. Before coming back home, as I will call it, he was dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and that's where he was when he was on the panel in 2014. Before that, he was the Matheson and Morgenthau Distinguished Professor at the University of Virginia School of Law, where he won an All-University Teaching Award. And Chev, the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia, presented him with an Outstanding Faculty Award. And he did got his AB from Yale, summa cum laude, JD from UVA. He was first in his class. Okay, I wasn't, but it happened.
It's overrated.
After law school, he clerked for Justice Rehnquist. He, at that time, was a Chief Justice of the United States, and he worked as a public interest lawyer before coming back home. So I think it's time for me to get off this stage and let Jeanne take over. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you, David. Well done. Can you all hear? Is my mic picking up? And good morning.
No.
Welcome, everybody. That's better. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. And team, what a group up here. I wanted to begin with just a few comments of my own so that your expectations might be adjusted. After last night's beautiful and festive occasion, and after this morning's splendid annual meeting with the celebration of achievements and hopes for the future of the VBA, it occurred to me that this program might begin to sound a sour note. We hope that you will find it does not do that. But the Virginia Bar Association's Committee on Special Issues, the Virginia Bar Association's leadership, who was lined up here right in front of me, and the joint ADR committee of the VBA and this Virginia State Bar are showing, I believe, great courage and generosity in making room for this program and elevating to public discussion what is going on in America and how are we managing ourselves in trying to get along with each other. How do we communicate with each other, respect each other, try to solve our problems together, or just get along, as Rodney King had begged back in 1992. So I thank you, the Bar and the Special Issues Committee, for doing this. There is something wrong in America right now. We are exposed daily in the public square to disrespect for the opinions of others, to refusal to consider different policy options with open minds. Our national mood could be described as in part depressed, certainly angry, and alienated. This has seeped even into some of our friendships and some of our families. Having checked around with quite a few people, we also believe there is widespread dissatisfaction with this state of affairs, but we don't seem to know what to do about it. The Special Issues Committee's specific concern is, what are the possible consequences of this? What is the possible damage to our national psyche? What other negative consequences might be lurking if we don't get it together and elevate our culture and our communications? Thus, today's program in some ways is very different from the usual fare that we have in CLE programs. Our subject is not concrete. It is amorphous and it is beguiling. We could get distracted and run down any number of rabbit holes talking about getting emotionally involved, talking about how did this happen, who is to blame for it. Instead, we have isolated 3 goals that we hope we can begin to accomplish this morning, but today is just a beginning. One is to inspire and give hope to everyone in this room that we can do better. We can begin to change things. A second is to inspire people who are here this morning to take personal responsibility for what it is that you might bring to difficult conversations or conflict situations. And third, we want to assist the VBA as its leaders engage in planning and ask the questions, what can and what should we do to do our part to begin to turn around this situation and elevate the communications and the manner in which we respect each other and get along. How to accomplish this in an hour and a half, and it's less than that now. We came upon Jim Ryan's book, and this is the truth because we really didn't know where to begin. And so we decided we will be very disciplined. Using the approach in his book, we assembled this amazing group of people with such an eclectic range of experience, and we will ask this simple question. How can lawyers, how can educators, how can community members engage in ways that will elevate the discourse and begin to grow how we get along with each other? We will not talk about the history and the reasons here. We do urge you to please download your program materials. And if you are a guest here, ask your host who is registered to download the materials. They are not at all duplicative of what you will see and hear this morning. We have curated an interesting, very up-to-date collection of things to read on this subject. We have learned about and listed for you organizations that are now at work in your community or on the national level, trying to help communities have better dialogue, how to understand, how to get along. And some of them, we have noted, are looking for volunteers, so you can help in that way. What we will do this morning is we are going to start with Jim. Stacy has indicated that she might have a little comment she might want to throw in after hearing Jim's comments. And then we will fall back into a somewhat traditional presentation by Aram, and then Mechele and Stacy will bring up the last presentation. We hope we can save about 10 minutes at the end to brainstorm some ideas about what the VBA might do going forward, but we leave it to them. It is their decision and it is their planning, and we wish them luck. With that, Jim, can we start with you? And I think we'll just say, you may of course say what you want to say, but do you have any thoughts, particularly based on your work running the School of Education? What can educators do to possibly elevate the current situation as far as how people get along?
Well, thanks, Jeannie, and thanks for inviting me. Thanks to all of you for being here. You know, when I think about the role of education in preparing students, whether K-12 students or college students, to live and work in a diverse society, I think that they have a crucial role to play in at least two things. One is cultivating empathy, and the other is enabling students to understand how to disagree passionately but also civilly. On the first, you know, I think a lot of the difficulty that we face today is a lack of understanding, and in some respects a lack of curiosity about what leads people to have particular views. And my vision of empathy is that the whole point of cultivating empathy is cultivating a sense of what it would be like to be someone else. And so often we just breeze past that question and make all sorts of assumptions when we hear someone speak and decide whether that person is on our side or on someone else's side. And I think that there are a range of things that educators can do. And part of the reason we study history, part of the reason we read literature, is to understand the lives of others. But I also think as you get into the older grades, and I'm not saying this just to play to the audience, I think it wouldn't be a bad thing for educators to help students think like lawyers. And by that I mean, if you're going to be a successful lawyer, the number one thing that you have to do, I think, is really understand the argument on the other side. And that means you need to understand the best version of that argument, not a straw man. And so oftentimes the discussions in public discourse today are so strident because the two sides are talking past one another and they're not really thinking about the very best version of the other side's argument. And that, in a sense, is a version of empathy, right? In order to understand the very best version of another person's argument, you have to at least be open to the possibility that argument is not crazy. And oftentimes we don't even pause long enough to think that, well, maybe you don't have to be either crazy or evil to think that. And so enabling students to understand the very best version of a point of view with which they disagree, I think would go a long way to toning down the stridency of conversations. And one of the things that I've done in the classroom, which has been effective with students, is this is easy to do in a law class because there's one side, or there are two sides. I assign students to represent a particular side. I don't let them pick. And that often requires them to defend a point of view with which they disagree. And if you have to defend a point of view with which you disagree, you start practicing what it's like to try to understand someone else's argument before you try to rebut it. And then in terms of learning how to disagree, I think that educators can model this, and they can also give students both the freedom to do this and set some parameters, right? So again, if you think about lawyers going into a courtroom, you know that's a place for disagreement, but you also know that there are certain rules of civility. And I think getting students comfortable with the idea that it's okay to disagree without rupturing friendships or rupturing relationships enables them to practice the art of disagreement. And one of the things that I think is really missing today, and you see this on college campuses in particular, but I also think it's in high schools and in middle schools, is the idea that you can't be either passionate or principled and civil at the same time. That there's somehow, you lose the purity of your position if you're willing to engage in a civil discussion with someone with whom you disagree, and perhaps disagree vehemently. And so there's a sense that in order to demonstrate the depth of your conviction, you almost have to refuse to engage or engage at a level that would make it seem like you actually respect someone else's point of view. And I think educators not only can do something about that, but have a responsibility to do something about it.
There is a lot of wisdom in all of that. Can you, I'm sorry to follow up with a question so quickly, but do you see, how are the K through 12 teachers going to do this? Are they being educated to do this now? I love your reference to how history and literature help us learn empathy. Could you talk a little more?
Yeah, yes and no. The preparation of teachers varies widely in this country, and it's not as if there's a uniform curriculum, so you could say anyone going into the classroom is being equipped with these skills. And it's also not the case that there's one particular approach that will work. What we started when I was the dean at the Harvard Ed School was this website called For One and All. I think that was the name of it. And it was basically a collection of best practices, some of which we shared, but some of which just came from what classroom teachers were doing. I mean, the K through 12 is a huge range in terms of age, and what works for a third grader is going to be different than what works for an eighth grader. And a lot of it has to be context specific. I mean, I think the best ways of doing this is to organize something around something that matters to the kids, and that may be different in New York or Texas or California. But like anything else, learning to have a constructive conversation with someone with whom you disagree, learning to disagree civilly is a skill. And so, the key thing is to figure out engaging ways to practice that skill, and you can do that in all sorts of ways.
I think Stacy wanted to, at this point, make a brief comment, although she's going to come back later in the program.
Well, one of the things that we talked about yesterday in planning for this particular panel is the importance of unmasking and unrobing titles. And when we looked at the panel here today, we've got the president of the University of Virginia. We have professor, we have lieutenant colonel, we have past president of the VBA, president of the Old Dominion Bar Association. And in this conversation that we're going to have today, and in the conversation that the country has to have moving forward if we are going to unite and be a better America, is we have to see past the title, or we have to be able to take off the title. This is Jim. When Jim goes home to his family, they don't care about what he does at UVA all day.
That is so true.
They don't care. My mother, She doesn't care that I'm president of the Old Dominion Bar Association. She doesn't care that I keep people in good hands at Allstate. All she cares about is that she's a single mother that hasn't talked to her daughter all day. And as a retired mother, she wants to talk to her daughter about all of the irrelevant things that she's done all day, but it means a whole lot to her. And all she cares is that she has my ear. The same on the other side of the table. We are human beings. Aram, Mechele, Jeanne. And what we have to do is we have to make sure that when we're talking to people, that we look at them as individuals and we respect them as individuals. Because the other thing about those of us sitting up here, some people are going to run to the front after this and they're going to want to speak to the president of the University of Virginia. Why do I say that? Because one thing we must be cognizant of in this conversation that we're going to have moving forward is that we approach people a lot of times based on their titles and based on who we think they are and based on what we think we're going to get from them based on their title. And so we already approach these situations with preconceived notions about how they're going to be dealt with. And so I encourage you, as you are listening to Jim and Stacy and Jeanne and Mechele and Aram speak today, that you listen to us as individuals, giving our own opinions, not necessarily the opinion of the president of the University of Virginia or the president of the Old Dominion Bar Association, but as individuals, because the individual collective body of understanding is what's going to move this generation of folks and this body of people we call America forward.
Thanks, Stacy. This is a perfect time to...
Can you move your mic closer? They can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Stacy. This is a perfect moment to move over to Aram, who hopefully you will tell us now from your experiences in two very different settings and cultures dealing with conflict. What have you learned and what do you think, what can you teach us?
I'm not sure I can teach you anything. I'm going to grab that there, though. Thanks. Move forward here just a little bit. Okay. So,
I can take a lot forward.
yeah, a lot forward. Let's move over. There we go. So, good morning. Great to be here. And just with what Stacy was just saying, I am here in uniform, and I'm allowed to do that with some ethical review, which I think lawyers can appreciate. But I do need to give a disclaimer, which I think lawyers can appreciate, which is that my views are what I'll share with you today, and they're not representative of the Army that I represent or the government. And so that's just need to make sure that's clear. Great opportunity to be here. I think we are here today because there is this national malaise that is occurring around how we converse and how we have dialogue. And I'm going to share some experiences from what we've seen as we try to engage more effectively in Afghanistan and Iraq. My experiences in Afghanistan over the last 17 years, 17 and a half years now. And maybe some of the lessons that we can try to bring back and say, how do we use this to be more effective in conversing with each other? So about in 2009, as was explained, I helped found the West Point Negotiation Project, which was a response to feedback we were getting from graduates who had been deployed and said, you know what, I'm really good at coordinating missions, engaging with enemy forces, and really doing a lot of the tactical things I need to do to be successful. But what I'm not very good at is engaging with someone 3 feet away from me who isn't an enemy, who actually may be on my side, may be on the fence, but I'm not very good at that. I'm not very skilled. And what Jim was saying with regards to the skills around empathy and even how do we manage disagreement, it is a skill. And I think in my experiences as an Army officer is those things are things we need to teach, train repetitively. Having done some work with FBI hostage negotiators, they'll say the same thing, that having effective conversations are things we train. And I really appreciated what Stacy said about unmasking, because I think to really make genuine dialogue occur, we have to unmask. My Afghan friends would often say, we will forgive you any cultural faux pas, right? Which is really important for us. We spend a lot of time trying to understand the culture before we go there, but we're still going to make mistakes. And what my Afghan friends would say is, we will forgive you for those cultural mistakes, as long as we can look in your eye and we can see that your intent is good. And so that means just being Aram and not being some rank or something else, and that comes through some training. Through the negotiation project, we've had a lot of opportunity to do some training with a lot of different folks. Very personal for me, though, because my first deployment to Afghanistan was in 2003. This is a story I share quite often because I think it's evidence of how difficult these skills can be to practice, and how, even though a lot of it is just common sense. And so in this case, the gentleman in the middle here was a gas station owner who, because of where we had built our forward operating base in 2001, we put his gas station on a dead-end road. And I don't know about many of you, but I've never gone to a gas station on a dead-end road. It's always on the way I'm coming or going somewhere. And so we effectively put him out of business. And when I arrived in Afghanistan in 2003, he had a claim that had been kicked down the road. It was not a priority for a couple of years. And so one of my jobs was to, in addition to other claims, was to deal with his claim. I mastered all my negotiation experience and skills, found out what we could offer him, pretty much was told give him a very low offer on what his claim was, met with him one time, didn't listen to what his problems really were, how this had impacted him and his family over 2 years, made the ridiculously low offer, which he was quite upset by, left the meeting with no resolution, and went back to my fob. A couple days later, I found out he was at the gate demanding payment. He was going to take the settlement that we had offered him because it was better than nothing after 2 years. I was too busy to go meet with the man. I sent one of my clerks out to pay him off, and that was it. We had a few days later, we had a convoy coming past that gas station, coming into a gate, and they were attacked, and we had several soldiers injured. He was not involved. Did he have knowledge? We don't know. But it was a lost opportunity. It was a lost opportunity to build a relationship with a business owner in Afghanistan. And you want to talk about a rough place to be an entrepreneur. Afghanistan's one. And so we lost that. Why? Because I couldn't communicate with someone. And we had guys injured. Fortunately, no one was killed, but we did have guys injured. And maybe we could have learned about that. Maybe we could have been introduced to other folks. Maybe we could have been a little more effective in our area through just some better engagement techniques. So fortunately for me, and here's something you probably don't hear every day, I ran into a great group of lawyers. So some great folks out of Harvard who were students of Roger Fisher, particularly Jeff Weiss, who became my instructor in grad school, started to teach me that there's a little bit more about how we more effectively engage. And so it was one of the first times when I went off to grad school to reflect on this failure and the cost to my organization and maybe our mission success. And so I learned a lot through teaching. I want to turn it over to Mechele because there's more stories. We may flip back and forth, and that's okay. I'm full of stories. We had successes. I think Jeanne brought me here not because I'm just a terrible failure, but some of the successes on second and third deployments, and so we'll get there. But I think it's nice to honor the power of teaching. So maybe talk about some of the work you're doing.
Okay. I am teaching Well, I'm writing a book. That's why the Neglected Middle Class is up there. It's the name of the book that David mentioned earlier. I'm so excited to be back with the VBA. I keep seeing friends, and if I go off, if I look at someone and I start waving, it's because I haven't seen them before, and I'm very excited. So the Neglected Middle Class is the book that I am writing, and I'm teaching 2 classes. One of them is actually an undergraduate class at UT called the Neglected Middle Class. And the other one is a class that is housed at the law school, but also has students from the School of Public Policy, the School of Education, and the College of Liberal Arts. So it's a completely interdisciplinary course and it's called the America's Struggling Middle Class, because when you're a place as big as the University of Texas, once you name a course something, they will not let you change the course. So even though I wanted them to both have the same names, that was not to be. The premise of the class, and if we could get to the first slide, this is actually from the syllabus of the course. And the premise of the class is our middle class is disappearing, it is hurting, it has been in decline for 50 years. And what we do in the class is try to come up with ways to rehabilitate the middle class. So there are a couple of sort of rules of engagement, right, that we use in the class. And the first is, I tell the students, I have lots of views about the middle class. Don't assume, though, that my views are any more important than the reasoned, rational views of your classmates. And so sort of the ground rules are, don't just expect me to tell you how to solve all the problems of the middle class. Listen to each other. And then the other thing you see that I have in red is that I tell the students that I've structured the class in a way that you have to collaborate. And you have to listen to the views of each other, even though you may not like those views. And so each week, and we'll see, and I'll show you a couple of the questions. Each week I break the class into small groups. They have a question, and it's randomly, different groups each week. Each group has to discuss the question, has to come up with their responses, solutions, concerns, or whatever about the question. They present it to the full class, and then the class gets to discuss both the question and also the students' responses. So I have a couple of examples here. When we talk about the, of course I did it wrong, okay. There we go, thank you. So one of the weeks we talk about is employment. What's happened to the middle class in terms of employment? So this was actually a question that one of the students generated, because one of the course requirements is for the students to actually generate some of the questions each week. So, you know, why are skilled jobs so stigmatized? If we're thinking about the middle class, they may be a better way to get to the middle class than going to college for 4 years. And so right off the bat, the students sort of noticed one of the reasons that we don't like skilled jobs is because we're told growing up. The students that are in the class range from second and third generation lawyers. I have students whose parents are judges. I also have students who grew up on the border in Texas and their parents are undocumented. So they recognize that some of the reasons maybe we don't want to value trade schools and trade jobs that involve trades is because we're told early on that that's not for us, right? We make fun of the plumber. And so I was really it was interesting to see that they knew that we look down on people who are not like us. And then they also brought up race. I think I can handle it. We also brought up race, that one of the reasons that we look down on those jobs is because if we look in history in terms of the people that held those jobs, they're racial minorities, they're immigrants. Then we talked about education, right? So one of the things that we know we do in K-12 education is we say, here is the accelerated and the gifted and the AP. So we silo our children at a very early age. And then we say, but if you want to do that trade stuff, go over to some other school, someplace else, and do the trade stuff. So it was interesting to see how many of the sort of race, class, how you're brought up, what you see in the media, that the students were able to come up with. And this was it was a great discussion. But the rocking and the rolling moment came with this discussion, which I never sort of didn't see this one coming. So again, we talk about the upper middle class, which I reject as a concept, but we can talk about that later. And so I talk about, the question was, public schools in higher income areas are typically better. You know, they have better resources, and our K-12 schools are becoming increasingly siloed socioeconomically. So the question was, to fix the inequalities that we're seeing, should we have wealth and socioeconomic diversity? And they have lots of options. Is it necessary? Is it beneficial? Is it detrimental? So this is a totally, they presented the goals and what we think we want to have happen in K-12 education. One, they noticed that there are some problems known as the parents, right? So even if we think socioeconomic diversity is a great thing, parents have a different opinion when you try to use y'all's children, right, as laboratory experiments. But then the rocking and the rolling moment came, and this is one of the things that I make sure the students understand, a point that Jim made, is we're thinking outside the box. No one is evil. No comments are crazy. Any solution, let's throw it out there and see if it might work. So one student, and I had no idea that this was going to set the class on fire, create sister schools and bus the students each Friday. So this, after about 20 to 25 minutes of discussion, became the bus the kids from the ghetto to the rich white people's school each Friday. The thing that was wonderful about the discussion is the class was split almost evenly. But within each side, the ones that thought this was a great idea and the ones that thought it was a horrible idea, there was complete diversity. We had children who grew up poor, thought it was a great idea. Children who grew up poor thought it was a horrible idea. We had rich kids who grew up rich on both sides. We had Black students, Latino students on both sides. It was a very spirited conversation. No one backed off of their views, but it was very civil. And I think the reason that it turned out that way, I'd love to say it was because of my direction, part of it, but the main thing is we had everybody was on both sides. And so you couldn't look at the other people that were saying it was a bad idea and say, you're evil, you're wrong, you have bad motives, because they look like you, they grew up just like you. So with that, so that's sort of the way that my solution to how we're going to get students, law students, and now I'm going after the undergraduates as well, to be able to talk about controversial topics. I force them to do it every Tuesday and Thursday for an hour and 15 minutes.
Did you want to pick up, Aram? You said you had some more stories you wanted to tell after Michelle.
Sure. So what I appreciate about, really appreciate what Michelle's doing. And I think the power of education is the requirement to look at things differently. I have 6 kids of my own. I hope that when they get, now, but also as they get into college, that teachers are, and different leaders in their lives are going to force them to look at things differently and I appreciate Jim, what you were saying, take the other side, take the best case argument of the other side and really understand that really well. When I came back to Afghanistan in 2000, I went back in 2010, but then back again in 2011 to work for General McMaster as his chief of engagements on the Counter-Corruption Task Force. Thanks to people like yourselves, thanks to some great teachers, Jeff Weiss at Tuck and others, I understood some things differently, and one was the need to understand the other person, where they're coming from, to truly empathize and cognitively to really understand their case and to really care about that. One thing we often use as an example is if you think about the last person you had a difficult conversation with, who was just resistant and wouldn't listen to anything you had to say. Everybody got that person in mind? The conversation may have happened this morning as you were leaving or something. How likely was it that that person was going to persuade you of anything? Probably pretty low. there is a reciprocity around persuasion, which I think by listening to others, we get better. So the story here was this gentleman, very influential leader, and I'll leave his name out, who we couldn't get to the table, and had been working for a year, just to get to the table. And he would notoriously schedule meetings with our senior leaders, with general officers, and then blow them off, just not show. It was a power play. The phrase was, we have nothing that he wants. He's got his own militia. He's got his own little fiefdom. There is no incentive to get him to come to the table and talk to us. So it wasn't even the fact that it was contentious. We just couldn't get the conversation to start. So I took some time to try to understand what he had said before in previous conversations, to understand what his real deep concerns and motivations might be, how he might be thinking about his situation, choices before him, and came up with a proposal of about 10 things that I thought served our interests really well around counter-corruption, as well as would serve some of his concerns around his reputation, pride, some fears we thought he might have for the future, as well as kind of honoring some of the successes he had. And this proposal might bring him to the table. And within 24 hours, I had an email back, not from one of his staffers, which is what I expected, because I was a lowly major at the time. He responded directly and invited me to come to speak at his quarters. And so we brought up a media team to highlight some of the things that were going on there, which was really important in 2011 and 12, to highlight some of the successes we'd had in Afghanistan after as long as we've been there, and met. And during that meeting with him, I shared with him a note that I had translated into Dari, which really just said, hey, sir, I just want you to know there's somebody down at ISAF headquarters who's trying to understand how you see your problem. This is what I think I understand, but I don't expect to have it right. And I hope that going forward, we might be able to work together. And from that moment on, he kept every meeting. We were able to put into play several actions around corruption at border checkpoints and airport security locations that became the precedent for what we did elsewhere. The story I like to tell is that two stories. One, he was supposed to meet with one of our general officers. Weather was bad. Our general couldn't get to his location, so he drove 2 hours out of his way to keep the meeting. Complete behavior change from where we were before. I don't think it had to do with anything other than listening, caring, and being able to demonstrate those things. The other story is that I left Afghanistan September 2012, and on Christmas Eve 2012, as I was sitting in my home in West Point, I got an email Christmas card from this gentleman, just wishing me the best of the season. And so we had totally changed the nature of the relationship. And again, those skills around communication, listening, were what were essential to that.
Mechele, perhaps you have another story you want to tell at this point, but one of the things we talked about among ourselves, in your materials, what you will see, in addition to resources, we have included a couple of very one-pager practical communication tips, and they look so simplistic. As anyone up here will tell you, they are so hard. The listening piece is perhaps the most key of any. But I want to invite any one of the four of you to comment on a couple of concerns that we shared with each other. And you've started to answer one. How do you motivate someone? I was asked this question the other evening. If you very much want to have a conversation, you want to understand the other side, and you're just hitting a wall, they don't want to deal with it. How do you motivate someone? That's to even get in the conversation, much less try and agree on something. How do you deal with emotion? Because isn't one of the most fundamental problems when we are facing a conflict or a difficult conversation is that really powerful emotion has been triggered, either our own because of something that's been said or done, or we can sense that the other person has that. And what are good ways to deal with the emotion? A third thing that is related to that is this nasty, devilish role that fear plays, how to recognize fear, and what is it often very responsible for in terms of other people's behaviors, and, let's be honest, our own behaviors. Do any one of you want to comment on those? How can education approach those, K through 12, college, law school?
I'll go. We know law professors, right? There is never a chance when I can't talk. So the way that I handle it in the class, I'll sort of take on the motivating students to talk when they don't want to talk. The way that the class is structured, it's a huge problem. And I think a lot, sort of the discourse that we're having in this country and the incivility we're having in this country is a huge problem. So I don't think that we can approach the huge problem of fixing the middle class. So I do this weird gesture all the time in class, that we start off the class talking about the big problems affecting the middle class. But by the end of the course, their final paper is a 10-page, if they're undergraduate, 12 to 15 if they're a law school paper, that identifies one concrete problem that affects the middle class. So it's going to be small, really small. And they have to come up with one concrete solution to that problem. And the way that I'm able to get them to talk is I make them realize you don't have to solve everything. So if it's a huge problem and I'm having difficulties with them sort of addressing it, then I just keep breaking it down and taking out little aspects of the problem until we get to a place where everyone can sort of feel comfortable talking about the problem. So I'll give just a couple of quick examples of papers that students have written in the past. When we talk about the middle class, there's huge disagreement over who belongs in the middle class. Is it just based on income? Is it based on occupation? Is it based on education? People have really strong views, and a lot of it is because a lot of us self-identify as middle class even though we're not. And so a student's paper that he wrote was on the census, when the census goes out, and on your income tax forms each year, let people say what they think they are in terms of class. So we're not judging whether you're right or you're wrong if you earn $250,000 and you feel that you're middle class, or you own $30,000 or you earn $30,000 and you feel that you're middle class. So the student said we need to kind of know who self-identifies as being the middle class. So why not let the government just to ask a question? You're not being judged. It doesn't matter what the answer is. And so one of the ways that I've approached huge controversial problems in the classes, both of the classes, is I break them down into sort of bite-sized portions.
And part of something else that we discussed in terms of the bite-sized portion is that you have to, again, unmask, and you have to find the common ground, and you have to understand, as Aram shared in his interactions in Afghanistan and how he ended up with that Christmas card, is that you have to determine that everyone is a student. You all are in this room today because in some way, shape, or form, you are intrigued by this topic. There's no CLE credit for this topic, so you don't have to be here. It's a Saturday morning. You don't have to be here. You could be at the cheese shop in Williamsburg, but you're here. And so in every society, in every piece of our society, there's a teachable moment. And we, as the social engineers, are teachers. But what we have to understand and learn how to do is unmask so that we meet our students where they are. And the conversations have to happen, and I love what Aram said. The gentleman who he was trying to converse with didn't want to hear what he had to say because it was completely irrelevant to him. He didn't see where the conversation was necessary. We run into these issues now. Let's see, I'm the millennial on the group, so I think Facebook started when I was a sophomore at the College of William and Mary. So I was the inaugural class of Facebook users. And one thing that we couldn't do back then that we can do now is we can delete people. And we can block people. So, I don't like this person's opinion. I'm going to block them. I'm going to delete them. I'm not going to even expose.
This is just virtually, right?
Yes.
Okay. I don't follow Facebook that close. I just wasn't sure how powerful it was. Yeah.
But I can completely disregard an entire group of people that I don't want to hear what they have to say. I can sit in class and have a conversation with someone across the country about something that means something to us and not talk to the brilliant student that's sitting right next to me either because of a truth or because of something mental that's not truthful at all. I don't see where we have that connection. And so what is incumbent upon us is to find the teachable moment, to determine that every interaction that we're in is a teachable moment where there is a student and we can get involved and delve deep into who that person is and teach them based on the level of where they are willing to receive the teachable moment, which is what Aram told us about. In that, and how we deal with the fear aspect, which is something else that Jeanne talked about, I just want to take us through an exercise. And I recognize some of you may have played this game, I'll call it a game, where you'll go to a social setting and you'll get a list of questions. And what you're asked to do with that list of questions is go around the room and determine who can answer that particular question. It's an icebreaker. But what it helps you to do in a room of people who you do not know is it helps you to find the commonalities between you. Some of them are broad commonalities. Some of them are very specific commonalities. So what I just want to do, and I'd ask you all to take part, just to raise your hand. Raise your hand if you're a part of a bar association. Raise your hand if you've had a client who has refused sane advice that you've tried to impart upon them. Raise your hand if you travel out of the state frequently for work. Raise your hand if you as an attorney wish that you had more time to spend with family and friends. Raise your hand if you take the time to participate with youth organizations. Raise your hand if you've had your world rocked by that legal staffer who was your trusted and knowledgeable counterpart who decided that they were going to resign. Raise your hand if you're the first in your family to graduate from law school. Raise your hand if you're the first in your family to graduate from college. Raise your hand if you grew up in a single-parent household. Raise your hand if you are the caregiver of a family member who's older. Raise your hand if you've lost someone in the last year unexpectedly. Now, what I did not ask you all to do that I should have is look around the room at the other folks that have their hands up. Those folks are a part of your common ground. They are a part of a group of folks, or some people may call your bubble, but I'll call it your bubble of commonality. And what that means is regardless of everything else they have going on, if you were to sit in front of that person, you could have a conversation based on the things we just talked about. The loss, having to regroup from your legal practice based on the fact that your right-hand man walked away. You can have a conversation based on the fact that you want to spend more time with your family, but this profession that we love so much, that is, as we've been taught, is a jealous lover. It takes us away from that opportunity. This is our common ground. It doesn't matter about politics. It doesn't matter about social histories or anything of the like. It's just who we are as individuals in this room and the common ground that we have. And when we break the titles down, as we talked about, and when we break down everything else, those are the things as individuals that we can talk about and build upon in terms of moving our world forward. Now, one thing that I want to take the opportunity to do, because I'll never get this opportunity again, is I do want to break common ground by welcoming the president of University of Virginia, and I will use that title one time, to this wonderful place.
I thought it was Jim.
You're going to be the president to this wonderful place called William and Mary at Williamsburg. And I say that only to get into the next point, which is that we're all in the same place. As this room is probably well divided between those that went to UVA and those that went to William and Mary, here we are in this room in the same place. And I first had that dynamic when I was at the public defender's office. And I had a moment one time where I was being a little ridiculous about being a William and Mary graduate. And one of the other attorneys looked at me and he said, "Stacy, but we're in the same place." And that was powerful. And it made a lot of sense to me. We are all here in the same place. And no matter what room you end up with, people that don't look like you, who don't talk like you, who don't dress like you, you're all in the same place and you're there for a reason. And so what you do to move it forward is you find that common ground with that person. You learn from that common ground and you teach that person what is important while learning from that person at the same time about how to move forward. That's how you break down fear.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Stacy. Jim, I wondered, did I notice that you wanted to kind of also jump in on those general questions?
This conversation has been terrific, and I'll pick up where Stacy left off about common ground, but I also think this relates to what Aram and Mechele were talking about. I do think looking for points of agreement is really crucial, and they could be things that you have in common, or in a conversation about the middle class, for example. I think distinguishing between means and ends is a really important thing to do, and we hardly ever do it. And that's to say, as I was listening to your conversation, the way you set up the conversation about the middle class is you first got agreement that we should be concerned about the middle class, and we should be thinking about how we can improve the lives of those in the middle class. That's a principle. That's a shared goal. Okay, then the conversation is about the best means to achieve that goal. Well, if you are focusing on the means to achieve a shared goal, that's a conversation that should have a much lower temperature than a conversation where you think that you're the only one who cares about the middle class, and the person who's disagreeing with you actually doesn't. And if you think about some of our most heated conversations, my guess is that those who are on opposite sides of those conversations believe that there are no shared goals. And so starting out by talking about, well, what are we actually trying to do? What are our principles here? What are our goals? And is this really just a debate about the means? It sounds simple, but I'm convinced that if you can then keep going back and say in class, for example, or in a negotiation, well, let's just remind ourselves that we have this shared goal. All we're really talking about is the best way to get there. And we may have some really heated disagreements, but it's not going to be a disagreement that comes back to, I can't believe that you don't care about the middle class, or I can't believe that, and this happens in education all the time. Like one side thinks, well, I care about kids and I don't think they do. Or I care about safety and they don't. And if you can keep it focused on the fact that we share a goal, and that I would think in your conversations with the person you talked about in Afghanistan, what brings a person to the table is to recognize that you two have something in common, something that you could do together that would be better for both of you. And you can do the same thing, honestly, around shared interests, shared experiences. I mean, I think we're also in an age where we emphasize, and sometimes we don't have a choice, I recognize, we emphasize some aspects of our identity over others. And we don't realize that we all have multiple identities in terms of our multiple goals. One of the things that we did at the ed school, and then we did again at UVA in the fall, was a storytelling event called Double Take. And Double Take, it was stories that make you think twice. And I don't know if any of you have listened to The Moth, which is a story program that's on NPR, which is fantastic. So we invited students, faculty, and staff to share their stories, and then we recorded 100, and then 8 people gave their stories live on stage. I'm a huge believer that if you tell your story or listen to someone else's story, you're bound to develop connections in ways that you never anticipated. And I can tell you that this event at the Ed School became the single most popular event every year. It was standing room only. And it was not just powerful to hear the stories of those who presented, but everyone in the audience sort of looked to the right, to the left, and realized, oh, you have a story that I assumed I know it, but I realize now I don't know it. And my guess is part of your stories are things that I can relate to.
If I could just jump in for a minute, Jim, when you were talking about identifying a shared goal and trying to keep the conversation to that, one of the things that we do in mediation when things are going forward and backward, and we have a whole bunch of mediators here in the room, is that sometimes we have to bring people back and say, if we're in joint session or even if we're caucusing separately, can we remember that what you said you wanted to accomplish is,
right.
And we just very gently remind them, and then they're willing to go back and talk about that. They might have vented a little bit. So that is an important technique. But you wanted to speak, Michelle.
Well, this is not a slide, but it's another story from class that I thought about when you were talking, Jim, about how I tell the students, you have to listen to what the other person is proposing, because they may be able to get you where you want to go, though it's not at all the path that you thought you would need to get there. And so one of the questions, we were talking about employment, it was the employment week, and one of the questions that a student had generated that became one of the small group questions was, if we look at the unemployment rates by race, the unemployment rate for blacks is always higher than the overall rate and the rate for whites. But one thing we don't consider is the number of, it actually was black and Latino, the number of black and Latino young males that are incarcerated. So those rates aren't even reflected in the unemployment rates. And so the question was, so what should we think about that? What should we do? And so the small group that discussed it, they talked about sort of K-12, we need to do better in K-12, we need to stop the school to prison pipeline. They talked about sort of structural and systemic racism, and they presented to the full class. And then a student who I just adored, he was a hardcore libertarian. He raises his hands. My heart stops because I have no idea what's about to happen. And so I call on him, and he says, and literally this is the gesture, because he was seated and the small group was behind him. He said, what they just said was fine. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be awful. But what I really think we need to focus in on is making drugs legal. Because if you look at the number of black and Latino males that are incarcerated, a lot of them are being put in prison because of low-level drug offenses. If you didn't keep putting them in jail because of small amounts of marijuana, then they'd be back in their communities. They'd be working in their communities. They'd be taking care of their spouses and their children. So I really think that the way we could deal with this unemployment issue is just to legalize drugs. At which point I paused and I said, I didn't see that coming. And then the whole room just sort of broke, and so on the last day of class, I talked about that moment. And I said that one of the things that I hope you all have learned to do in this class is don't assume that just because he's the hardcore libertarian that often says things that makes you angry, that there are some times when he's going to come up with a solution that you would never have thought of, and it may be a solution that in some situations might actually fly.
Aram, did you want to add something?
Yeah, so, and I love that story. We don't naturally get to, we don't actually get to the best solution right away, right? So emotions get in the way. No one's ever been in a meeting where they say, you know what this meeting needs? It needs more emotion. So we typically want to stiff arm, give the Heisman to the emotion, and yet emotion is an important part, right? And so we want people to be passionate, and then that doesn't prevent us from being civil, right? So we want people to be passionate. We want people's emotions. We know what emotion initially, when it's really out of control and our amygdala gets hijacked and prefrontal cortex is inoperable, we know that doesn't lead to good conversations. So we've got to be able to move past that. I think that means being able to hear people out, really listen to what they're saying, and then try to get them engaged in creative problem solving. And that only happens when we ask good questions. And I'd love to go back. I'm going to share a story, but I'd like to go back to some of the questions you raised, Jim. And I want to just share a story. Good questions, caring questions, I think is how we lower emotion. I think it's how we deal with fear. Fear is a real thing. I think it's one of the biggest interests we always have when we're engaging with one another. How am I going to be seen? What's the long-term implications for me, for those around me that I care about? So we've got to be able to manage those things. But one more story from Afghanistan, and it does deal with this idea of listening to what people are saying. I had an opportunity to present in Herat to a group of civil society and government officials, 20 or 30 folks. It was supposed to be a 2-hour session, turned into a 3 to 4 hour session with translation. As an interesting note, in talking about power of language that we use and how language is an insight into our cultures, I started off with the great quote from the movie Miracle, Coach Brooks, when he says, for some any hockey fans out there, when Coach Brooks says, great moments are born of great opportunities, right? Great moment in the movie, right before the American team plays the Soviets in the semifinals. And that's what you got here, boys, tonight. Well, Afghanistan, after 40 years of conflict, actually has a great opportunity to shift the direction they're going. And there's a phrase that for too long in Afghanistan, the problems have been solved by the sword. Okay, that's not a problem we necessarily have here in terms of physical violence. A lot of ours seems to be our inability to communicate. There was no word, when I used that quote, there was no word for opportunity, right? There's no Dari word to translate an opportunity. It doesn't exist in their language. It's very indicative of the situation in the last 40 years. I wasn't aware of that. We ended up on a 10-minute derailment because we had to explain what an opportunity would look like if that were to happen. And for this very well-educated, group of people. So I got to present. We got to talk about some of the things that we've been talking about here tonight, how we have better conversations, or today, sorry, not tonight. And that was great. About a month later, the gentleman who's sitting off to my right up there, David Muradian, very good friend of mine, we were having lunch, and he said, Aram, did you hear what happened in Herat? And I said, no. Did something bad happen? He goes, well, kind of, but not. He said, one of the government officials who works in a finance office, a young man who listened to your presentation a month ago, is also a lead singer in a Afghan rock band. And they were planning a music festival. And a local mullah caught word that this festival was going to happen and went to the governor and put the kibosh on it, put an end to it. It was too Western, all these things. And he goes, in the past, one of two things would have happened. Either it just would not have happened because they just would have been compelled by the authority not to do anything, or there would have been some bloodshed. There would have been some sort of violence, or there would have been reaction. He goes, instead, this young man, thinking about what questions I could ask, asked the governor if he could meet with the governor and the mullah in a meeting, and he sought to understand the mullah's thinking. Okay, and understood that this was about a fear about appearing to be too Western, a fear about tradition and values, a fear about what was going to happen with faith and religion. And they came up with a solution where the mullah actually launched the music festival, by giving a prayer. They came up with a solution where music was traditional, as well as playing some music that the younger folks wanted to play. And they were able to hold the music festival because it was an amazing solution to what never would have happened in the past. And it really comes through this power of asking better questions and being courageous enough to do so. And I think, Jim, as I read your book, I think that's a big part of getting to an effective dialogue is asking people better, deeper questions, being willing to learn, and then really listening to what they're saying.
I agree.
Highest book. No, it's really, go ahead.
I want to go back to Stacy's Facebook to tell a story involving me. So I graduated from high school in Memphis, Tennessee, and most of the people that I graduated, or a large percentage of the people in my class, didn't go to college, and so they would be characterized in the media as non-college whites. That's who I went to high school with. And one of the things that we've seen a lot is sort of angry, people won't speak to each other, people have lost friends, they block, they don't on Facebook. And what I have done, mostly because I'm writing about the middle class, is I had to tell myself, if you're going to write about the middle class and the disappearing middle class and what's going on with the middle class, it might actually be useful if every now and again you listen to and figure out where some of the anger is coming from in the middle class. And so when I would talk about and I'm just putting them in this label, they're my friends, but I'm going to call them the non-college whites because that's what the media refers to them as. And I would give these talks to other academics. It was, oh my goodness, you mean you actually listen to that? I mean, doesn't it just drive you crazy? And I said, but how am I going to understand a way to propose a solution if I don't even get where the anger is coming from? I don't have to agree with their anger. I don't have to agree with the way their anger comes out and the way that they direct the anger, but I at least need to know where it's coming from. And so one of the things in terms of finding a common ground, I love Facebook. I love Facebook. Maybe it's because I've moved around a bit and so I have lots of wonderful friends in different places, but I love Facebook because my common ground are children and grandchildren. If you post a picture of your smiling, cooing grandchild, it will make my day. And so most of my friends, me and my non-college white friends, we love each other's children. We love the successes of our children and our grandchildren. But by remaining in contact with them, and it's purely selfish, right? By remaining in contact with them, I'm able to learn things for my research that I never would have been able to learn otherwise.
Thank you, Mechele. Time is flying here, and another thing that Stacy was asked to speak to, before we turn over the discussion to brainstorming a little bit with the audience about how we might go forward. Stacy, maybe you feel you've covered this, but is there anything we should know about how the very young think about this problem? Do they even see a problem? What do they want to do? And what can we do?
My generation, we definitely see a problem. We know it's a problem. And I think we do a pretty good job of attacking the problem. The millennial generation, as we are called, we're very conscious of what is going on. And I think, as in every generation moving forward, you have the benefit of history. And my generation sits in a very unique place because we have the benefit of seeing the ebbs and flows, the good and the bad of just about every major historical event in U.S. history that has happened, going back to slavery, going to the women's movement or the suffrage movement, going through civil rights, going through probably our most recent, the LGBT community, and how that has transformed. And what we have been able to do is evaluate those situations without necessarily having to be wounded by it. And I think there is great learning that comes from, and great ability to move forward, where you can understand situations, you can see how others tripped up, how others thrived, and use that when you're not cut open. Because when wounds are open, wounds are deep. And even though they heal, you never forget them. But when you have the opportunity to reflect and see, not in the midst of a situation, but the resolution of a situation, it's extremely powerful to build upon that moving forward. America comes together, and we all come together in situations like France, when there's a bombing in France. You know, everybody's Facebook page, today we're all France. You've got the flag shown. But what my generation really wants to do, and you see it all the time, we're very good about having the small conversations in our college settings, and correct me if I'm wrong, with my teachers at the universities and my professors, you know, we're very good about having small dialogues, going back to the grassroots conversation. Nothing large changes from the top. We know that now. We've seen it time and time again. It comes from the intellectual conversations of the person next to me, of the organization that's most closely aligned, and then we align with the next organization. And so the younger generation is doing what we can in terms of talking, in terms of understanding, and in terms of listening, and we get that this world has problems. We've seen the results of the problems, but we understand that we can't move forward as a society if we don't remedy these problems.
Stacy, that is a wonderful lead-in on our schedule to beginning to engage with the audience and to the question that we all kind of did wring our hands about last night, is talking about these skills, having these conversations, dealing with motivation, listening. Is this all for naught in light of the larger impact that we are all subjected to through the online community? And I kind of want to throw that out there. In our front row, we have a guest who is Samantha Borders, who is working with the dean at the George Mason School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution. And I understand from your dean, Julie Shedd, that they are just beginning, and you're not aware of what others, you're not aware that others are working on this. How can we protect ourselves so that what you and the millennials are good at doing are nonetheless protected? Samantha, do you have any comment you want to make at this time?
So thank you for letting me be a guest here. I'm a doctoral candidate.
Can you all hear her?
Sorry, it's a little bit easier to project this way. I'm a doctoral candidate at the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution in Arlington, Virginia. And the associate dean and I are actually working on a project where we work with communities directly on both media literacy skills as well as dialogue skills. So this project's been going on for about 2 years now, and what we do is we partner with Fairfax County Public Library to take everything you all have talked about from the macro level to the micro level of our communities. Because what we've noticed is that there's such a huge divide, not only around consumption of the news, but also how do we talk about it effectively, as each and every one of you has very eloquently pointed out. And what we've been finding is that the meaning of how do I appropriately consume, look at the news, and how do I talk about it, is a way in which it can spread like wildfire if we teach basic skills that we kind of take for granted in terms of what people already know. And in my own doctoral research, I actually look at political dialogue and personal relationships. And I teach my own sets of classes on basic communication skills. We look at these wider narratives, we look at these grander, larger schemes, but what we often fail to look at is what are we doing in our own communities to help foster relationships around difference between person and person. And what's been interesting to find is how often anger is mentioned. Out of the interviews I've done, out of the people I've worked with, anger is the thing we talk about the most, anger and fear. And by confronting that head on and teaching about the role of emotions and how to appropriately identify them, how do I de-escalate this as an individual, not as a professional. Because the people I work with in both projects are not professionals in conflict resolution. They don't have the benefit of the education, but that's actually an easily translatable and learnable skill set that everyone can learn. And I really appreciate the efforts made by everyone in this room. Absolutely, the panel has pointed out excellence, and I really feel like as a group of people who are interested in changing the way we think about political difference, the way we think about difference in the United States, it does start with grassroots. It does start not only with our communities, but it starts with our personal and private relationships. I don't even have to ask. I'm sure that at least several of you in this room have lost relationships or have watched other people lose relationships over the current political divide. Now, this is something that can be surmounted, and while it can seem like this large dragon in our midst, it's actually something quite small and close to home. And I guess my ultimate comment would be to submit to you that this is something we can overcome if only we learn how to talk to each other person to person without masks.
Thank you, Samantha. And that's in our last 3 minutes, 4 minutes. I'm going to say we have 4 minutes. Can we turn to just popping out ideas, if any of you have? I'm sort of staring at the leadership of the VBA, but I think a question is, are there some interesting, innovative, collaborative ideas? Working with the universities, working with educators, anything that we can do. We can't decide anything in this little bit of time, but are there small steps that you might consider? There is a draft visions statement in your materials, so see, another good reason to download your materials and look at them. Any thoughts, please? Anyone from the audience? Yes.
One of my thoughts as someone who has a disability is I really feel that there's a big responsibility by parents and the actions that they do. Many times I am places and I love kids because they're not filtered. They'll ask whatever's on their mind.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it starts. And I will have a child come up to me and start to ask me questions. Why are you in a chair? Why can't you walk? Why can't you? And I want honesty to begin at that level. I want to talk to that kid. And the mom or the dad will come over, grab the child by the arm, and yank them away and tell them, don't do that, that's not right, it's not a good thing, you're embarrassing the person, you shouldn't do that. And I know that's a small example, but I think it starts that small. If your child walks up to someone and asks them a question about why are you black, why are you wearing, and you know, what does that rainbow mean on your shirt? Let kids ask questions. It takes away the fear. It starts that little, because once they have that experience of being dragged away from me, because it's bad to ask somebody with a disability a question, they are always going to be afraid to do it. And that's where I think it starts.
Thank you. Thank you. Perhaps some sort of educational traveling program about dialogue in communities and include that. But are there others? Yes, Jennifer Ligon, who is the new chair of the Young Lawyers, and we're hoping the Young Lawyers give us good ideas and maybe run with it.
Thank you to everyone. That's a very tall order.
Stand up, please.
The thought that I've been having the entire discussion is how you overcome the lack of ownership that it seems individuals have and recognizing when there's a problem. When I think of my own little bubble of family and friends, the divisiveness that happens is a blame game when they feel that either their idea, their political party, their belief is being challenged, and they are not willing to engage in these conversations and listen, but instead want to blame the other side for something. How do you break down those barriers of feeling like, I'm not going to take ownership of this, I'm just going to point my finger at the other side? Do you see that in the classrooms?
We talk about this and teach it a lot in mediation. Again, I see all the heads bobbing. Yes, there is, just as one example, there is one sheet in your handout. It's called Flipping the ABCs. It's, we don't even realize how often we are operating on assumptions, and even more subconscious than that, and they're usually followed by blame and criticism. So if you flip them, you chuck the assumption, you tell yourself, first I'm going to do C, chuck the assumption, try to check out some facts, begin to redefine what are we talking about, what is something we might share, and then acknowledge, okay, maybe there's something here we can talk about. There is no magic wand unless any of you want to have one that you will, it's proprietary. Oh, go ahead.
I was thinking during this program, you talk about how we're going to engage, especially young people in school. And I think a great model for this is Mike Pace's Rule of Law program, where non-educators, lawyers, are going into the school and talking about the rule of law. Part of the rule of law is being able to have communication with people you disagree with and do it in a respectful way. So I think the model of getting non-educators, professionals from many professions into the school to talk to kids at a young age about communication and how that works for our whole society is a possible model to use.
That's a great idea. Jim.
So one other thing that I think is worth keeping in mind, and I think it's lost too often, and this is also something that we can teach to students and also remind adults, is that a lot of times it's actually okay to agree to disagree. I think we often find ourselves in sort of pointless conflicts. You're drawn into a conversation with a neighbor, or think about the Thanksgiving dinner table. Like, do you really have to try to convince your uncle about the error of his political ways? Or might you just say, okay, let's agree to disagree? And when I was growing up, I was on the debate team in high school, and I knew I wanted to be a lawyer, and my dad told me I should be a lawyer because I couldn't really do anything else, had no skills whatsoever. And he was fond of saying it's not always important to be right. And to prove that I wasn't listening, I said without hesitation, yes it is. And I never understood what he meant. And this, I think, is part of why I was interested in being a lawyer and then a law professor, until I became a dean. And then every single day I thought about that advice. And the wisdom behind it is it's okay to let some disagreements go by. I mean, in some ways, you have to think about, well, what's the goal here? And you don't go into every conversation thinking, oh, I have an end goal. But you might catch yourself avoiding pointless conflicts if you just think, well, what actually am I trying to accomplish here? And is it just fine if at the end of the day we decide, okay, we're just going to disagree about this? And some of that also means, what are the lines that, if someone crosses, like, you can no longer continue a relationship? And my guess is there are some of those lines, but not so many. And a lot of times the rupturing of relationships or the preventing of the formation of relationships occur over disagreements that really are not that important. And so part of this too, I mean, part of the challenge here is to just recognize when you're in a situation where it's fine to say, I don't actually have to try to win this.
Great, thank you. David, are you going to wrap us up now?
I will do so.
Your materials.
Obviously, and I don't need to come up there with
Oh, please do.
There's been a fertile and good discussion, and this is in the category of to be continued by the Bar Association with Rich's help and guidance. We plan to bring this topic and antecedent topics forward in ways that perhaps will help with the legislature and efforts that Stuart Thomas identified this morning, help with the judiciary, which has to rein in, unfortunately, over-enthusiastic litigants in many occasions, both in the way they write and in the way they speak and in the way they advocate ineffectively, ultimately, for their clients. So we thank you. This has been a wonderful morning. We thank our panelists. This book is worth getting, and it's for sale right outside. Unfortunately, President Ryan cannot stay to sign copies because in his work, he has to go catch an airplane today. So let's thank the panel.